Okay, so my name is Steve Davis, and I'm another one of the co-organizers for this event. I'm a faculty member here at Booth, and I want to say two other things about myself by way of background. I've been working with confidential data within the federal government, derived from administrative records and survey sources for 30 years. So many of the challenges that have come up sound quite familiar to me. And just by way of full disclosure, I should say I also work with proprietary data, and in particular, one of the things I do with proprietary data is I help DHI produce a monthly newsletter on labor market indicators that derives from their data on their dice.com platform, which is a virtual space that brings job seekers and employers/recruiters together. So we're fortunate to have another panel of 3 people and from different businesses who are either, I guess they're all currently in the business of working with academics one way or another, and have dealt with some of the challenges that we've talked about before, have experienced some of the benefits as well. So I think we'll go in order, and but let me introduce all 3 of our speakers. Going last will be Michael Umlauf. He's Vice President for Advanced Analytics at TransUnion, and we've already heard lots of great things about the TransUnion data. And we've got Jonathan Hall, Chief Economist and Director of Public Policy at Uber, and George McFerran, who's the Executive Vice President of Product and Marketing at DHI Group, is going to kick us off. George, take it away.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks for inviting me along, and good to see you. So I thought I'd just give you a bit of an introduction as to who DHI is, and then some background on how we're working with Dr. Davis, and then perhaps just some of the kind of challenges we face as an organization around how we deal with our data. And I think to some extent, I think we have a unique perspective because we're a relatively small organization compared to a couple of the other guys on the panel here. And I think that brings a unique set of challenges for an organization that absolutely wants to do more with its data, but at the same time, we're a smaller organization and we have different constraints around how we can do this and how we allocate our resources. So it's a different take on it. But first off, who's DHI? So we run a number of career portals for different industry verticals. The main ones being dice.com, which is technology, predominantly based here in the US. We also run a career portal called Security Clearance Jobs. Includes in the name, it's for people who've got security clearance. And then we have another portal called eFinancial Careers, which is in financial services. And that's more of a predominantly UK and Asia-based business, but we have a pretty good operation here in North America as well. And the key premise of what we're doing is we're bringing together job seekers and employers and giving them an opportunity to connect in a marketplace. As we go through, we've been around for a while, Dice was one of the first career portals on the market, launched in the mid-90s. And in the space that we're in, it's, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, it's a fast evolving space. There are some big behemoths in the market. When you look at the likes of Indeed and LinkedIn, perhaps the 2 biggest market leaders, and ZipRecruiter have come up fast and furious in the last few years. And then down at the bottom end of the market, you've got a lot of innovation going on. You have a lot of smaller players who are snapping at people's heels and trying to come up with new ideas. And so for us, we see ourselves somewhere in the middle. We focus on the industry verticals, and to some extent we're in a bit of a squeeze middle at the moment, so we're trying to figure out how we compete with the bigger people in the market, but also how we keep the smaller, more nimble and agile competitors at bay on the other side. So again, I think that puts us in a pretty unique position. So what data do we collect? Well, given the marketplace we're in, we have a unique opportunity, and I think this is where we like to think we differentiate ourselves, because we see both sides of the market. We're able to see both the supply and the demand side in the employment market. We can see what employers are looking for, the skills and the location, and to some extent we're starting to collect compensation information as well. But we can also see the supply side on the other side as well, the people that are coming to the market. And we can then we were starting to look at where the differences are between that supply and demand dynamic, which I think, for me, I find fascinating, and I think that's where the value is in what we can provide by having this unique insight into the marketplace, but specifically around people's professional skills and the impact that has on the broader economy and from and planning as well. And so as you take that forward, the area that we've talked about and that we've always been interested in is turnover. And turnover matters in our world. for a number of reasons. The ripple effect of people changing jobs, I think, is fascinating, because as one person changes jobs, that means they're moving to another employer, they've left a gap, so that company has to employ somebody from another company. So that ripple effect keeps on going. So when you're looking at an economic indicator and some indication of sentiment, looking at the turnover rate and the frequency with which people are changing jobs is a very interesting indicator on the health of an economy, and particularly the confidence within an economic environment. Because I think if you take that from a soft perspective, for someone to change jobs, that's a huge decision to make. Most people would rather pursue promotion within their existing employer. Changing to another company is a big risk. If someone's prepared to take that risk of moving to another company, they must feel pretty secure about many other things in their life. So if you start to see turnover rates increase, then you've got increasing levels of confidence in society around their feeling, their position, around where they may be taking their lives, and the broader picture. So for me, that ripple effect is really interesting, and that's some of the data we're starting to talk about with Dr. Davis, and that kind of led us to our collaboration with Dr. Davis around a number of pieces. So we look at something called, we have a regular feature called the hiring indicators, and this looks at the vacancy duration. So how long is it taking for organizations to fill their jobs? And so recently what we've seen is that vacancy duration is now at its historical highest level. So it's taking companies much longer to fill their open vacancies than it ever has done previously. So the employment market is tightening. So again, you can start to see that impact, and that again can be applied, and you can take inference from that. We've also started to break that down in terms of the size of an organization, small to medium-sized enterprise organizations up to bigger organizations. Again, starting to look at the differences between different sizes of organization. And then bringing it slightly closer to home from a DICE perspective, really starting to look at the market for certain skills. So the demand for tech skills, as we know, is something that is regularly in the headlines, and companies are continually complaining that it's very hard to find the people that they're looking for. So working with Dr. Davis, we've been producing some information around particular skills, and is it a tight or slackening market for particular skills, and starting to trend that over a period of time. And I think the utility of that and the value of that is significant, both when it helps individuals as they try and work out how easy it is to get a job or not, equally for employers when they're trying to figure out how they plan ahead for their workforce. And you can take that to a broader extent as well when you start to think about cities and counties and states are trying to figure out how they manage their workforces and how they attract talent and how they attract companies to come and locate themselves within their metropolitan area. The Amazon conversation, I'm sure many of you are aware of, is an interesting example of that, as companies are looking for talent before they relocate their offices, and this is the kind of information that can help inform those decisions. So for DICE and for DHI, clearly data and the collection of data is incredibly important. We're an internet site, and so we run off data. And so we collect it purely from an operational level to understand how we're running our platform better. We can improve the user experience, and then we can also start to look beyond as to how we build and develop new products. The interesting thing from our perspective as a smaller organization is that we actually grew by acquisition. So one of the challenges we face is that we've bolted lots of different companies together. And that makes it very hard to start to look at the data across the organization, because as we've grown by acquisition, the data is held in different repositories, in different formats, and in different levels of cleanliness and utility. And to be honest, it's a nightmare. So it's really hard when we think to ourselves, we've got all this great data, but it's really hard to actually get hold of it and use it in a meaningful way. And I think someone talked about that earlier on this morning. So it's important, but getting it in a format that we can use and get utility out of is hard. We've been around in internet terms for quite a long time, so a lot of our infrastructure wasn't built for the modern environment around how we manage and collect data. It's an area we're investing in, and it's an area we're trying to improve. But again, how do we make it available, and how do we help, or how do we contribute to academic research? That becomes part of the challenge for us, because we're desperately trying to get our own house in order, whilst we're also trying to support Dr. Davis and the work he's doing at the same time. So for smaller organizations, that's absolutely one of the challenges we face. I mean, looking forward, we're committed to investing in it, because I think there's a huge amount of value that an organization such as ours can add to the academic and economic research that goes on in providing information around supply and demand, compensation data, and start to bring in different third-party angles as well, so you can supplement that data and really start to get some interesting and valuable analysis around the way the workforce is headed and how organizations and governments can plan around that. But as I said, the challenges with that, I think there are several challenges for us. Again, as I look back over our history, the constant changes in our product have a dramatic impact or an unexpected or unintended impact on the data that we might be passing forward for research. And we've certainly picked up on a couple of instances where we've noticed a spike in behavior, and obviously internally we know, well, that's because we made a change to a user flow here. But actually that then flows through, which then Dr. Davis has to take into account when he's producing his research as well. So tracking that and being aware of what we're aware of internally and making sure that doesn't flow through and skew results, I think is important. Client behavior changes as well. So you could look at job postings. You could say, well, that's actually relatively simple. A job is posted live on the site for 30 days, and why can't you just look at job postings? But some clients repost their jobs every single day because they think it likes to get to the top of the search results. If you counted that'd be 30 jobs in a month. It's actually just one job advert and one vacancy, but it's been posted 30 times. So the things you've got to dig into, again, which we know internally, which before we start sharing, we need to be aware of. As I said earlier on, as a smaller company, it's a resource issue. We are resource constrained. We don't have enormous budgets or resources we can bring to bear on this. And so for me, in my role from a product perspective, is that constant balance between prioritization. We're invested in trying to expose our data and to clean our data up because we need it internally, and I'd like to get it out into the wild as well. But at the same time, we're a listed company, we've got shareholders we need to take into account, and they're putting us under pressure for all the good reasons that shareholders do. So getting that balance right, I think, is tricky, especially when you're investing in something that doesn't necessarily have an immediate return, but in the long term, if you have a strategic view, it is incredibly valuable. So that's always a challenge for us. And then the final piece, I think, is around our IP. Again, exposing our data or making our data publicly available. This is what we use to build our product. This is what we use to gain our competitive edge. And so where's that balance between what we want to hold on to and what we think someone could use to our detriment, and what do we think is contributing to the greater good? And again, that's a balance we discuss and debate internally. There's definitely a balance to be found there, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Great. Thanks very much, George. Okay, Jonathan.
All right. Is this working? Very good. So I come from Uber, which you would, a company that matches drivers and riders, but ultimately also a company that does a lot of academic outreach, and it's not obvious why that is. And so I'll sort of explain why I think it is, but I'll start with my overall sense of where academic corporate partnership is, and I think it's basically non-existent relative to where it should be. The amount of unrealized private surplus that could be generated by having faculty and students work at companies is embarrassing to both, and it's everybody's fault, and it's because both academics and business people need to think more like business people ultimately. And so the standard academic pitch to companies is, oh, well, there's this really important literature that we're trying to expand. We're trying to push forward the bounds of economic science. And the company says, well, that sounds kind of cool. And this is a bigger problem than just that. I had dinner once with Commissioner Groshin of the government statistical agencies under the Obama administration. She said, if only you could understand how important this data is to you, you would feel an obligation to help us out. I said, well, you're an economist. Like, we're self-interested actors here. Like, we need a reason to participate in this. If we can free ride off of it, we damn sure will. And so I don't know what the BLS can do about that, but it's quite obvious that there's unrealized potential with private companies. And I think one of the reasons that I hear for that is that sort of, for some reason, despite the fact that American companies are known for taking risks and investing in high expected value outcomes, they're not willing to take those risks when the risk is public disclosure of some seemingly important fact. And that decision is usually not driven by an expert. It's usually driven by somebody in public relations, which is really not a very good excuse. And so we've surmounted this problem at Uber, and I think it's because of a series of basically lucky sequences, but we've established a model that I think is worth replicating. And I'll explain what we do and then what we should also be doing on top of that. But a few things that happened that were lucky were that I started as sort of an almost academic style researcher before there was really a PR function at the company. That was lucky thing number one. Lucky thing number two was that the company's reputation then tanked so badly that the downside risk evaporated. There's essentially no reputational hit that we could take as a result of my academic research, and the upside suddenly became much more relevant. Usually it's sort of, people don't care about the upside, they only care about the downside risk, and at Uber we had this reputational debt overhang that solved that problem. And then the third thing is that we have now in place the best PR people I've ever worked with. And they are actually able to see the long-term value of doing research. And so that segues into what is it that we do exactly. And so I technically work for the head of our public policy and PR team. So my job is actually to engage with academics and do basic research that then we can sort of transform into public policy, white paper kind of materials, and ultimately into our lobbying and policy and PR and even legal efforts on the ground. And so we actually have basically a team of academics that we pay to work with outside academics whom we don't pay. And in fact, we write down a contract with those academics that says, we're going to write a paper about the value of flexibility to Uber drivers. And that's what we're going to do, and we're not going to pay you. And in fact, you can walk away from this with what we discover and publish it with no fear of retribution from Uber. We actually commit to that ahead of time, which by corporate standards has been totally crazy. No other company I'm aware of has that sort of as a standard first approach contract to doing research with the academy. But there are obvious reasons to do this, and their credibility. In the public policy space, you want to be credible, and if you pay somebody that's not so credible, or if you have the right to pull back what they write, that's almost as bad. We're not perfect in that we get to decide what gets studied, and no good deed goes unpunished, and so we get a lot of criticism for actually not just simply opening up the entire company to whatever academic wants to do research, and that's the fight that I'm engaged in now. But we have this sort of innovative approach, and it's created enough value that the company's been willing to invest literally millions of dollars in compensation for the team that I run, simply based on getting the right people to study our data and write papers about it. So that's kind of cool. But that is actually just a small percentage of the potential value that academics have within our company, because we have an actual economic engine that we're trying to build, which we call the marketplace. It's a piece of technology that's built and maintained by engineers, data scientists, and economists. And the frank reality is that the people inside of economics departments are just much better at building marketplaces than we will ever be. The talent in departments like Booth's or Stanford's or Harvard's is impossible to conjure in the corporate setting. And so I believe that actually we're neglecting the obvious gains from trade of bringing people in, having them design our product for us in exchange for no money, and then so basically doing work for free, and then publishing a paper in the Econometrica 3.5 years later. The risks are very small. They're not zero. Lyft could read the Econometrica paper or the draft or see it presented at Stanford, but the benefits are so large that the idea that we just simply can't do this because of the sort of IP concerns or the risk that our great ideas will be scooped, the calculus is way, way off. And so I think the academic community needs to approach companies and make the cost-benefit proposition, not the this is great for the literature proposition. And then the companies need to have strong advocates who can actually stand up to PR or to legal or to whoever it is who's unwilling to consider any exposure on the downside and say, look, this is a business. We weigh costs and benefits and expectation all the time. There's no reason why we shouldn't do it in this setting when the smartest people in the world are willing to work for us for free. That seems like something we should really seriously consider. So look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Michael. And
Yes.
I think Michael has a slide presentation.
Yeah, I have a wonderful relationship with our PR department, and they insisted that I show the fruits of our marketing department's work. And so I'll share that with you as a backdrop. I think primarily this is a little bit of visual to go with the message, but I think most of what I'm going to be talking about will resonate a lot with what you heard from the prior panel and from the panelists here. Maybe with a little bit more of a regulatory flavor and something that's more akin to the data that we manage. So again, my name is Michael Umlauf. I lead the financial services analytics team at TransUnion. My team primarily works with our customers on custom modeling and analytic projects, product development work, and a limited R&D effort, primarily in the machine learning space and trying to use the latest methods to get things done. One of my other responsibilities is to co-lead our university partnerships, which are historically sort of tactical and moving towards strategic, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is and sort of why we are here working so closely with KILTS now. We've been sharing data with academic partners and research institutions for probably 15 years, generally on a one-off basis. I think we've had some repeat business with Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia and some other institutions, but for the most part, these were sort of one-to-one contracts and arrangements. They were sort of static data sets for one purpose, and they had an expiration date, and everything was nice and neat. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into building these relationships and these assets, and so that's a big consideration of why we're working with KILTS now the way we are. So I'll tell you a little bit about TransUnion because I don't want to assume that you know everything about that, but get on to kind of the model that we use to think about our kind of emerging strategy around university relationships. So the number wall, TransUnion's having its 50th birthday this year. Originally as a credit bureau, the core of the company came out of the county credit bureau, actually. But since we've really grown into a global information analytic company that really has been moving far beyond that base. We've been growing very rapidly in the last 7 years. We've had new leadership come in, and they've set a very different tone, and we've emerged as a public company 3 years ago. At this point, we're managing about 30 petabytes of data, 90,000 sources, which is partly a function of the fact that our database is built off of furnished data from lenders, our main data. And we service about 65,000 customers globally, affecting something like 1 billion consumers worldwide. So it's a pretty big footprint. To add to that, the bureau business is somewhat siloed, so there are different bureaus in different countries. Now we're in 33 of them. Most of those are sort of like replicas of what we do in the US from a credit bureau perspective. As it happens, a lot of our investments globally have been in areas of emerging development. So we've got a lot of really interesting conversations going on between what goes on in developed countries and emerging markets. We're very active in India, South Africa, Colombia, Brazil. Canada is one of our developed markets that we're big in and have a lot of history. So that's our kind of footprint. And I think, I don't have time, and you probably would not want to hear all the details of what a bureau is, but I think it bears to at least talk about this at a very high level. Now, you heard from Chase earlier, and most of our lender customers generally have sort of an account-centric way of looking at the world. And they'll assemble different views around that data, but fundamentally they're looking at account-level relationships. So what the credit bureau's function really is to do is to assemble that into a consumer view that's as complete as possible. And that's what we try to do with the furnished assets that we get from our lender customers, as well as some of our alternative data assets that we license and partner with. So I thought it was important to mention that. But the consumer stays at the center, and we've been expanding our universe of data assets that we have access to within our walls to include things like rental, insurance, property alternative credit, and things of that nature. I think it also bears mentioning that we have lots of stakeholders and lots of responsibilities. The first and most important to us is stewardship of consumer credit data. So all of the personally identifiable information, all of the financial information that goes with that is handled very securely, and we have massive investments to try to protect that data. It's always the top priority no matter what. That said, the data is not very useful if it's not used, and so we, along with our new leadership and our launch, kind of relaunch of the company, new branding and everything else about 5 years ago, we were fortunate to have a pretty forward-thinking CEO come in and challenge us to put a very simple guiding principle around what we're doing. And that distilled down into something, you've heard this for good formulation multiple times today, but our version of it is information for good. I'll tell you what that means. So very explicitly, there are these 5 kind of pillars that we think about around this concept. And the way to work through it is there's businesses are going to use this very complete data set that we have to drive smarter risk decisions. There's going to be a greater certainty about who they're doing business with as a result of the data assets being deeper and more complete. And so they should realize healthier bottom lines as a result. Then you pivot over to the consumer. The consumer, we're trying to enable them to maintain the accuracy and completeness of the data, to have hands-on control over it. Put those two things together, you get a reliable credit market that drives economies and ultimately serves this goal of enabling customers to achieve higher living standards. And that's certainly something we've seen play out particularly in the emerging markets that we've been involved in. So from an academic partnership perspective, I think the opportunities and the benefits I think we see as very similar. We recognize that we have only limited resources to spend in various ways, and we do have an internal research division. We don't have any illusion that they can do everything that we might want to do with the credit data that we have available. In fact, we know it's a very deep and powerful repository. We don't want to be in a position to be the only ones interpreting what that data says and what it means. So we explicitly want to partner, and what we've done has been through data partnerships on occasion, always depersonalized. In fact, the depersonalized data set that Kiltz now has is depersonalized from the consumer perspective, from the lender perspective, and also we've aggregated loan types up to a relatively coarse set of, I think, either 5 or 7. But there's a very specific intent to try to protect our customers' identity as well as our consumers' identity that's in the database, and that's reflected in the Kiltz repository. We also sponsor research on occasion, conduct it jointly, and we're very active with some of the universities that I've mentioned before in terms of managing practicum and capstone teams through various master's programs. So what do we get out of this? Obviously, new ways of looking at things. So credit market trends are not necessarily things that are going to pop off the page. Lots of smart people need to look at it lots of different ways in order to see them. And so we automatically get the benefit of that when we partner with researchers. Mindshare, we're getting out. People are becoming aware of our capabilities. Independence, I think Jonathan mentioned, the fact that if all of the research that interprets our data is coming out of our walls, we recognize that that's limiting and is not really a necessary constraint. And then just from an education perspective, the more people who are interested in our industry that get their hands on the data and understand it, the better. Obviously there's some awareness of credit data in the room, and we talked about some of the nuances before. I think somebody brought up the fact that certain trade types will fall off the file after certain intervals. You can have 2-year intervals for inquiries, 7 years for certain kinds of things, and that can create dynamics that are not evident or can trick you if you're not aware of that nuance. So, and in fact, that's one of the reasons we think our kind of internal modeling team is such an asset to our external customers who have that capability, because we're so used to working with the data, we know where the pitfalls are. So I think that's the kind of thing that becomes broader knowledge as we work more closely with academics, and that's a benefit to us in very direct ways. So another concept I think that's come up before is this notion of a balance. So if you kind of sort out the different objectives of stakeholder groups, ours is obviously to our customers and our stakeholders, and in terms of keeping data safe. I think from an individual researcher's perspective, obviously having a topic that's new and engaging and something that can be driven from this data set it's come up before in some of the things that have been discussed that's important. I think we treat the safeguarding of data as a shared objective. I think we would all agree that that's important. We're all in the database too. So, but in order to get to effective partnership, we have to prepare ourselves for situations where those objectives might be in conflict. And that certainly comes up in small ways even when you do everything right. And so we want to lay the groundwork to make sure that everything is done correctly. So our 15 years of experience doing this one-off has given us sort of a template that enabled us to get started. Meanwhile, Kiltz was in the process of sort of taking the model that they'd established working with Nielsen and thinking about how that could be used in a different way. And I think we were sort of inspired by that at a time when our CEO was actually looking for ways to invest some of the assets that we had to drive this information for good principle. And so that led us to work directly with Kiltz to figure out how TransUnion data could be added to the repository. So I'll just kind of finish off here by saying I think about what it takes to create an effective partnership and what's worked so far, and what I think Kiltz is a good example of in our opinion. The very first thing that should happen before we even start talking about data is having some shared vision around what the research is that needs to be done. It's a little harder to do in a general purpose sense, which we have with Kiltz, but I think we established early on that we had very good alignment around shared objectives. For us, that means testing those objectives that the partner is bringing to us against the 5 pillars of information for good. So we're using that guiding principle to drive this kind of an investment and relationship as well. If we make it past that threshold, strong governance process is a matter of distilling the best and most important pieces of our contracting experience out. So that implies things like research proposal reviews, standing up resources to be able to go through preliminary research together, looking at publications before they go out. And I think that's a cadence that we get into with all of our academic research partners, but we want that to be embedded in our contract so everybody's clear on what the expectation is. The expectation is not that we will censor the research, it's that we'll try to guide it appropriately from the beginning and make sure that we don't set off in a path that's going to create things that set us out of balance from an objective perspective. And then finally, from an enforcement perspective, I think this is the piece that maybe is the trickiest. So even with a good contract, there has to be stewardship on both sides of the relationship to make sure that things go well, because things will come up that are unexpected. And that's one of the hallmarks, I think, of the way Kiltz is organizing against the task, and we're doing the same. So we probably have, between our different university relationships, we probably have 2 or 3 people across several people dedicated to just maintaining those relationships and the data flows and everything else and make sure it's good. We see the same kind of commitment on the Kiltz side, which is helping to head off misunderstandings about how data can be used, how it should be retained, how it should be destroyed, and things of that nature. I can tell you an example. We had a researcher bring a proposal to us last year that we were kind of excited about to do some anomaly detection research in data streams. So if you think about the data coming into our walls, how can we find things that are out of whack? We never made it to the contracting stage because we realized we couldn't do half of what was proposed without exposing PII, which wasn't within the scope of what we were willing to do. So we basically stopped it. So our model, is also catching things that aren't a good fit. I think there was also a case of maybe an enforcement lapse last year. We had a relationship with one of the Federal Reserve Bank's data set that was sort of stale and old, and it got misinterpreted into a study that subsequently had to be pulled back and revised. So that was a case where I think if we'd had a conversation with the researcher ahead of time, we could have avoided that situation, and it would have been preferable for both sides. So the framework is simple. It's pretty basic. It's worked for us, and I think it really is a pretty good fit with the way Kiltz is aligning against this problem in the space.
Jonathan, I want to turn to you, and you made a passionate case for working with academics. You made some remarks about the smart minds at Princeton, Harvard, Chicago, and places like that. I'm sure that went over well with the academics in here, but I wanted to get a concrete example from you of where the vision that you sketched has already played out, if one has, in terms of a new product for Uber, a new platform design, a new service, something where this has come to fruition?
It hasn't.
It hasn't
No,
yet,
I have no
okay.
examples of this.
Okay.
Zero.
But your
we're
boss,
working
your boss is convinced it's coming.
My boss is the head of public policy and
Oh, okay.
isn't directly involved in this, but it's definitely coming. And so we're investigating a bunch of different options. One thing that we're thinking about is sort of in place of chief market designer, which would be somebody with a suite of skills that, if it exists anywhere, it's in a couple of people who would be impossible to hire. In lieu of that, what we're thinking about is sort of an advisory board of people who combined have the experience and expertise that we would look for in designing from a leadership position our marketplace. And the hope there would be that if we assembled that kind of a body, that those folks would be interested in actually seeing like, oh, that's the project that I can do right. I'm going to help with that, and I'll do it in exchange for publication rights, or I'll do it in exchange for money, or some combination of the two. We're not quite there yet, but there's certainly a lot of interest. There's a lot of pushback from people, mostly people who don't really understand what they're talking about in this regard, about whether the IP rights would be a problem, whether publishing would be a significant risk to the business. The answer is, of course, as I've said many times, yes, there is risk, but we have to weigh the benefits and the risks, and so there's a lot of education that needs to go into that before the VP of engineering is on board, because he's spent his entire career being told that IP is simply a black and white issue, and that if IP is generated, then no academic is involved, full stop. But our CEO has a lot of experience working with Susan Athey from Expedia. She's on the board. We have the right people talking to the right people to actually make this happen, and if we can do it, then it can serve as an example for other CEOs to think about implementing.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't you a co-author on a study about the value of flexibility for Uber drivers?
I am.
Okay, so I mean that maybe had, I thought that had a payoff of a different sort for Uber, and that it shows that there are values associated with the relationship that Uber drivers have with Uber, above and beyond just their compensation.
That's right.
The compensation. So maybe you want to say a word or two about that. 'Cause
Yeah,
that was
so
quite a fascinating study, and it should inform people's perceptions about how we regulate these non-standard employment relationships that are arising, of which Uber is an excellent example.
Yeah, so that's an example of a paper that I contributed to for the purposes of making this argument in public. So for those of you who don't know, the Uber driver has a rather different experience than the typical sort of low-wage employee of a company. The driver can work whenever he or she wants with no exceptions whatsoever. But the trade-off is that there is no guaranteed wage contract. So there are no unemployed Uber drivers, but they don't know what they're going to make, and macro and micro factors can mean that their wages change quite a bit. So there's a benefit and a cost. And much of the work that I've done has been illustrating the benefit of that sort of pure market flexibility. That work does generate insights that are important to the company. So for example, it highlights how valuable a product might be that allows drivers to express preferences, not just for when and where they're working, but for like what kinds of trips they're willing to do. Just to take an obvious example, if you want to stop working in 20 minutes, you're willing to do a short trip but not an O'Hare trip. And so there's overflow from this kind of work into the product. There's another better example of stuff that we've done that sort of bled over into the rest of the company without being direct product involvement. Is I have a paper that says a really simple model of the Uber economy would be that if you change the price of a ride, the driver labor market reacts in a way that basically undoes any benefit or cost for drivers. So if you somehow accidentally lower the hourly wage that a driver was earning from the marketplace, then some drivers will leave and the rest will be better off, and you should expect the wage to go back to whatever the labor market was providing as a second best wage, reservation wage. literally nobody at the company except the economists was thinking about it this way. And we wrote the paper because nobody believed the theory, even though the theory is really simple. And thank God, the theory appears to be quite predictive. But 2-3 years later, we have everybody at the top of the company talking about how we shouldn't be designing products to raise the wage rate because we have this open labor market. And that's actually a tremendous victory, enormously costly for our team. But it turns out that to convince public policy people, the people that our public policy team cares about, you also end up convincing people internally of the same basic truths.
It's an interesting example. George, I want to go back to you, and you talked about the challenges of collaborating with academics without for research, given you're a medium-sized company, you're not a behemoth, maybe that was your word. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, if you want to share some, about how the academics can facilitate that. I mean, the Kilt Center model we heard about is one, but you may have other thoughts about how we can make this not just more attractive, because we've heard a lot about the benefits today, but maybe more cost effective.
Yeah, and I think that's valid, because I think for us, the appetite is there. It's just that we struggle to find the resources to actually invest the time to get the value out of it and to support the academic research. So I think for me, it's almost, I think Jonathan touched on it as well, it's like how from an academic perspective, you present the benefits to us as an organization as to why we should be supporting it. It's not just about helping write a paper that might be interesting to a group of people who've got a niche interest. It's actually about how can we use that to add value to the business and ultimately add value to our customers, because that's what it's all about for us. So if that would certainly help me from a perspective of allocating the resources internally, but then also kind of holding our hand through the process as well. I think the example you pulled out there, JP, was fascinating, and help us through this and understand where the pitfalls are, because we haven't got that focus around how it might help us, and we have concerns around IP. So reassuring us about the concerns, showing us how we might be able to do this and how we might be able to get the information out, and understanding how it would be protected, and kind of, I guess, reassuring people, and then giving some insight as to where that might help us add value to our customers. Then it all starts to stack up, because at the moment, I guess it's me and a couple of others who are saying, look, we think there's value in this, and we want to explore the value. But that's not quite as compelling as it needs to be if we're going to actually get the resources to go make it happen. So I think it's about coming to us, and that partnership we need to figure out that partnership piece to help us build the business case as to why we should be doing it.